300-pound woman wants to enlist in the military, which seems utterly ridiculous to anyone. The conscription officer can't control the expression on his face and can only pretend to glance aside to ease the awkwardness. But how could the woman not notice the sarcasm on his face? Angrily, she claims she could kill an elephant with a single blow. Without caring for the officer's objections, she shoves him aside and grabs a steel bar from the fireplace. Right in front of everyone, the woman demonstrates her formidable strength. With a sudden exertion of force from both arms, the steel bar, as thick as a finger, bends effortlessly like a rubber stick. The officer is completely stunned by the woman's overpowering aura. He has never witnessed such terrifying, absolute strength. Not only does the woman win the applause of those around her, but she also catches the eye of the female officer, Maria. Confronted with such a powerful girl, Maria curiously asks her why she enlisted, and the woman simply replies, "To defend my country." With this simple answer, Maria not only grants her a place in the military but also promotes her to be her assistant. This wise decision not only helped turn the tide on the battlefield but also made her a terrifying killing machine, feared by enemies. Every battle she participated in left the opposing side with a deep psychological scar. But behind this military soul, her reason for joining the army was filled with sorrow. In 1917, after two major revolutions and the devastation of World War I, Russia's newly established provisional government was on the brink of collapse. The situation was extremely unstable. The men on the front line, concerned about their own safety, were no longer interested in fighting. Not only were they easily swayed by the invaders' schemes, but they even befriended them. When the nation's gates were wide open, it was only a matter of time before the country was destroyed. To awaken the fighting spirit of the men at the front, the higher-ups decided to form a female death squad and send them to the battlefield to fight courageously. However, no one expected that the women's enthusiasm to enlist would be so high. Whether they were poor rural housewives, wealthy noblewomen, homemakers who had never left their homes, or lively young girls fresh out of school, when they learned their country needed them, they all stepped forward without hesitation. With their beautiful long hair falling silently, everyone's eyes were full of tears, yet their pale faces remained steadfast. In order to protect every inch of the motherland, they voluntarily embarked on an irreversible path. Even knowing the battlefield would be littered with corpses, they were determined to march forward for the sake of their responsibilities. When the recruitment work concluded smoothly and the death squad was formed, over 500 carefully selected women became the first to join the battlefield. But these women, who had never received any training, did not understand discipline, and the entire square was filled with noise and chaos. To help these women quickly grow, so they wouldn't end up as cannon fodder on the battlefield, Maria conducted a month-long intensive training. Though the preparation time seemed short, the tests were extremely demanding. They not only far exceeded the previous standards for male soldiers, but even reached a devilish level that would intimidate anyone. Yet, the girls had no complaints. They fought desperately to complete every training task. Even when their physical conditions were hindered, they used their strength to avoid any obstacles. Through this harsh training, their new soldier careers passed day by day, learning the basics of military skills such as marksmanship, grenade throwing, and hand-to-hand combat. They also trained with new battlefield weapons, such as gas grenades and sniper rifles. Any skills that could help them survive, they learned them all. But even after such terrifying progress, Maria still did not approve. On the battlefield, it wasn't just physical strength and endurance that mattered, but the will to overcome all difficulties and the courage that was deeply ingrained in one's bones. Under Maria's orders, the girls were split into two groups. Her request was simple. They were to fight against their comrades, no matter what tactics or dirty moves they used. Victory was the ultimate goal of this contest. However, before the assessment even began, it was declared over. One girl, after being slapped, clenched her fists in anger, but after thinking it over, she reluctantly let go of her fists, as she couldn't bring herself to strike her comrade. Her weakness led to an even more merciless beating. Even though she was beaten to the point of vomiting blood, the girl still had no desire to fight. It wasn't until she received a heavy punch to her stomach, her face twisted in pain, that she was fully awakened. Screaming, she raised both arms and attacked. Her punches were wild and crude, like those of a street brawler. While they didn't cause any real harm, they unleashed a primal fury in everyone. Only by charging forward without fear could they truly survive on the battlefield. However, even after such intense training, some began to act up. As the day to go to the battlefield approached, one girl requested leave to visit her husband and wanted to experience a romantic encounter before heading out. Maria could not allow such an unreasonable request, but to her surprise, The girl not only felt no shame but also reported a comrade's secret affair. Hearing this, Maria was immediately furious. Without a word, she delivered a heavy punch. Anyone who could betray her comrades today might very well betray the country tomorrow. This was Maria's greatest taboo. The clever girl, instead of reflecting on her mistake, even argued with Maria, resulting in a vicious uppercut and her immediate expulsion from the death squad. Such a person would only become a disaster in the future. The humiliated woman, leaving in disgrace, uttered a harsh warning. Maria would pay dearly for this. At the time, Maria thought the woman was just trying to act tough, but the next day, she was taken for investigation. The charges were so absurd they were laughable. First, Maria was framed by petty people and forced to face a military tribunal. Then, because the female squad was a disgrace to men, it was at risk of being disbanded. Fortunately, Maria, with her righteous heart, wasn't afraid of authority and forced the informers to confess the truth. Though she cleared her name, this action angered her superiors. Just as Maria's military career seemed to be ending, the female soldiers of the death squad appeared in front of the office building, marching in perfect formation, strong and proud. In an effort to save their wrongly accused leader, they resisted silently. No shouting, no fighting, no threats. They stood like unmovable pine trees under the blazing sun. As night fell and heavy rain poured down, not a single one of them wavered. Standing straight like statues, they stood for 2 full days and nights, until the returning general was deeply moved by their actions. Such powerful will and indomitable spirit were hard to believe could come from a group of women who had never seen the battlefield. To verify their true abilities, the general not only reinstated Maria but also personally reviewed their training. The results were shocking. In just 1 month, these women, who had once known no discipline, had quickly grown into qualified soldiers, their combat abilities far surpassing those of soldiers trained for many years. This unexpected inspection led the general to make a bold decision. He would send these women to the battlefield as real soldiers who could fight. When the news spread that the female death squad would be sent to the front lines, the entire city was in an uproar. Both high-ranking officers and ordinary citizens eagerly gathered to see them off. However, the spirited female soldiers didn't know that what awaited them wasn't a battlefield filled with gunfire or men bravely fighting on the front lines. When the alarm sounded, the female soldiers quickly assembled, forming a beautiful defensive line. With Maria's command, their rifles raised in defense, ready for the unexpected threat from a group of men on the front lines. When the soldiers saw the female soldiers, they thought they were a visiting delegation sent by their superiors and rushed towards them. But as they got closer, they realized something was wrong. The glinting bayonets, which kept them at bay, and the deadly expressions on the women's faces made it clear this wasn't a friendly encounter. They once wore those same expressions, but time had turned them into cowards, although they had been useless in the face of the enemy. Seeing these beautiful, strong-legged women turned them into savage beasts. What they didn't expect was that these female soldiers' fierceness and bravery would make them feel utterly ashamed. The man hesitated not at all, pushing forward, but what he never expected was that the female soldiers didn't back down in the slightest. Trying to maintain his composure, the man lifted his rifle from his chest, attempting to regain some face with crude words. However, Maria rushed forward with a heavy blow and responded forcefully by firing her gun. They were soldiers coming to the front lines to fight, not objects for others' pleasure. The nation was on the brink of life and death, while the men on the front lines had long abandoned the idea of defending their country. Now they expected the women to shoulder the burden. It was as if they had lost all dignity. The men, after being scolded harshly, realized they had picked the wrong fight. They had no choice but to retreat. Ashamed, with the immediate crisis averted, the female soldiers quickly put away their weapons and set up camp in the frontline trenches. But when they saw their surroundings, their morale was completely shattered. Due to long periods without maintenance, the trenches were filled with all sorts of junk. To make matters worse, right in front of them, less than 100 meters away, was a fortress built by the enemy. Shocked, as soon as the female soldiers reported back, 2 enemy soldiers appeared with baskets full of sausages and wine, their faces smiling in a way that clearly indicated they were no strangers to the front lines. Instead of letting their guard down, the female soldiers carefully searched them. When a small notebook was found, the enemy soldiers thought no one would understand it. However, one of the female soldiers, a foreign student, immediately recognized the military deployment described within. It turned out the 2 were spies responsible for infiltration. As their identities were exposed, the enemy, realizing their mistake, tried to escape. In order to capture them alive for interrogation, The female soldiers didn't shoot immediately but instead pursued them, with one enemy soldier dead and the other injured. The female soldiers finally realized the true horror of war, but this was only the beginning. Two female soldiers were escorting the spies back for questioning when one of them accidentally fell into the trench and twisted her ankle. In order to complete their mission, the other soldier had no choice but to continue alone. But the innocent girl, inexperienced in the ways of the world, was easily tricked by the man's sleazy tactics. With just a few words, she was reduced to a trembling wreck. The man, taking advantage of her complete relaxation, pretended to fall and asked for help. The kind-hearted girl didn't suspect anything and helped him without hesitation. But that moment of kindness came at a great cost. The man pushed her over, and before she could react, his muscular legs were already pinning her neck down. Her small frame couldn't match his strength, and no matter how desperately she struggled, it was in vain, until her hands and feet grew weak, and her body began to convulse. This young girl, barely 20, tragically lost her life when the girl's body was discovered by the arriving comrades. Even the normally stoic Maria shed tears of grief. She knew that war always meant death, but she never imagined the misfortune would strike so quickly, and on the youngest and most innocent of them all. The comrades, their faces wet with tears, couldn't accept the tragic news, but before they had time to process their grief, a greater disaster fell upon them. Iron barrels, shaped like bombs, rained down, punching holes the size of fists in the ground, and thick yellow gas poured out. Though they didn't explode, the harm they caused was enough to devastate an entire city. This was the infamous poison gas of World War I, a deadly weapon used to ensure victory. Its arrival made the battlefield even more cruel. Everything, both human and ecological, was being mercilessly destroyed. Fortunately, one of the female soldiers noticed in time, preventing massive casualties. The soldiers quickly distributed gas masks to their comrades, preparing for the brutal battle ahead. However, when it was her turn to get a mask, she found the box empty. Even knowing death was imminent, she still struggled to leave the trench, wanting to fight to the very end. But the toxic gas soon overcame her, and she died in agony. With a call from the enemy, the attack finally began. The poison gas had reduced visibility, making it impossible to launch long-range attacks. The only option left to stop them was to form a solid defense with their bodies. Just as the enemy had hoped, the enemy intended to crush the female soldiers with their physical advantage. However, this naive plan was doomed to fail because they severely underestimated the women's ferocity. Facing countless bullets, the women charged into the enemy lines with their bayonets raised. Though the women had no fear of death, their physical disadvantage quickly put them on the defensive, especially since they had no battlefield experience, and their casualties mounted quickly. Seeing the dire situation, Maria and the remaining soldiers stepped forward. Their courage reignited everyone's fighting spirit. As the fog of poison gas began to clear, the heavy machine guns of their side began to work, and bullets poured out like there was no end. The enemy, now terrified, lost their will to fight, especially when they saw the massive woman leaving the charge. No one wanted to become a heap of mud under her hands. They scattered like dogs with their tails between their legs. Though they won the battle, the cost was steep, and the bodies piled up like a small mountain. Many soldiers could only leave behind their clothes as a memorial, and the female soldiers could only shed tears for the brutal reality of war. At this point, Maria, though unable to accept the grim reality, knew she had to be the first to stand strong. She knew this was just the first wave of the enemy's trial. What awaited them next was a true battle of life and death. To secure the nation's final line of defense, Maria rushed back to request reinforcements. But what she never expected was that the position of the highest commander had already become meaningless. The men, brainwashed by the enemy, not only lacked any will to fight, but had even formed a soldiers' committee to resist all combat orders. Unable to get any support from the rear, Maria rushed back to the front, hoping her women could hold the last shred of dignity for the nation. But to the men, the noble ideals of national duty seemed like a joke. To quickly end the war, they not only refused to offer any support, but even beat her mercilessly. They had no desire to participate in the war, only dreaming of returning to a life of comfort. But the repeated victories of the female death squad slapped them hard in the face and hindered their hopes of returning. The men didn't realize that if it weren't for the women taking the enemy's fire, they would have already been nothing more than a pile of corpses in the wilderness. Seeing this, a comrade rushed to intervene, but was shoved aside, only intensifying the man's violence. The worst part was that this scoundrel, devoid of any humanity, was none other than Maria's husband, whom she had loved for years. A brutal war, so senseless and cruel, had destroyed the last shred of conscience he had. As the onlookers began to disperse, Maria slowly regained consciousness, covered in blood. She couldn't understand how she had survived so many brutal wars only to be beaten senseless by the man she had loved. But for the highest ideal in her heart, Maria stood up again, her body shaking, but her determination unwavering. As night fell, the female soldiers of the death squad gathered in the trench, holding candles and praying for what would likely be their last moments. Knowing the enemy would soon launch a counterattack, they decided to take the initiative and charge, perhaps with a slim chance of survival. Under the cover of darkness, they took their weapons and gathered bundles of dry wood and barrels of gasoline, carefully crawling to the center of the battlefield to prevent the enemy from breaking into their last line of defense and to give themselves a fighting chance. Maria set everything on fire. As long as they were alive, no one would pass through their last line of defense. Even in death, they would use their lives to build a wall. In the midst of the fierce artillery fire, the female soldiers fell in droves, but none of them stopped or hesitated. They charged with even more ferocity into the enemy trenches. This war was destined to be filled with sorrow and despair, with many never again able to enjoy life's remaining days. Yet, not a trace of fear resided in the hearts of these women. In a time when the nation's very survival was at stake, the men were unable to do what these women did, carry the final dignity of the country on their shoulders. After a full day and night of desperate fighting, the enemy's morale was shattered completely. Until the moment of their death, the enemy could not understand how a group of female soldiers who had only trained for a month could possess such terrifying courage and fighting spirit. If women are considered unsuitable for war, there is only one reason: when they become determined. Even a god of war would have to peel off a layer of skin before they would stop. But despite their indomitable courage, the female soldiers could not withstand the enemy's never-ending reinforcements, especially with the men stationed behind them lacking any will to fight. Artillery fire rained down without pause throughout the night, and the commander stood outside, listening for the entire duration. As a soldier, he felt an immense shame and fury. If he couldn't lead others into battle, then he would use his own life to defend the dignity of a soldier. But before he could even step onto the battlefield, he was stopped by his own men at the door. They prevented the officer from joining the fight, citing the absurd reason that a commander couldn't personally go into battle and kill enemies. Furious, the major charged forward with a punch, but instead of showing fear, the men stepped aside, clearing a path for him. However, they weren't letting him leave. They were threatening him with a heavy machine gun. To leave this place, he would have to be a dead man. The officer asked if only commanders were forbidden from entering battle. Receiving a confirmed answer, the officers took off their epaulets and threw them on the ground in front of the men. Without those epaulets, they were no longer officers, just ordinary soldiers. And without the title, there was no longer any reason to stop them. With a thick spit of phlegm, the men showed no sign of shame. Instead, something in their souls seemed to be awakened, as though they had come to a realization. Meanwhile, on another part of the battlefield, the female soldiers' fierceness couldn't last much longer. With large numbers of enemy reinforcements pouring in, casualties among their ranks grew rapidly. Outnumbered, the female soldiers of the death squad were pushed back step by step, adding to their misfortune. Just as one of them was about to throw a grenade, an enemy soldier instantly took them down. Seeing their comrades about to be caught, a woman rushed forward without hesitation. Surrounded by enemy forces, the female soldiers' fighting space was rapidly shrinking until they were backed into the corner of the trench. If they were pushed any further, the entire front would collapse. Maria looked around at the young women, her heart heavy with pity. At this moment, she knew it wouldn't be long before they would all fall under the enemy's guns. But in the face of imminent death, none of them showed fear. There was only defiance and anger. When the vow was silently spoken for the last time, the girls had already prepared to sacrifice themselves heroically. But just then, the ground beneath them suddenly began to tremble, as though 1,000 cavalry were charging toward them. Turning around, Maria could hardly believe her eyes. The dawn of hope had quietly arrived at that moment. The defense line they had built with countless lives not only held back wave after wave of the enemy's attacks, but it also ignited the fighting spirit in the men behind them. At a time when the country's very survival was at stake, no one stood alone. Though their initial choices had been shameful, in the end, they stood together as heroes under the great cause of the